Welcome to the fresh fruit tutorial. It's just a quick overview of my process for painting this fresh fruit. Now I started with the blueberries. I did a light wash of a very light blue on all of the blueberries first. And then once I got that light wash on, I let them dry. And once they were completely dry, then I started building up layers. And I did that with a really dark blue, a mid-tone blue, and a lighter mid-tone. What I did was I just went in and I tried to capture the shapes and the shadows. I did some softening and lifting to make sure that the edges were not harsh. I blended it with a damp, dry brush, and I continued to build those layers so that I could get the beautiful look of that berry. And I wanted to make sure that they were as dark as possible. I also added a little red into my blue mixture to get the shadow colors. When I wanted to do the details, I worked wet on dry. I made sure that the paper was dry so that the details would stay nice and crisp. When I wanted to soften, I just wet it and took the tip of my brush and would soften an area. Now once I got all the details in and all of my color values and my tonal values correct, then I would move on to the next blueberry. I paid close attention to the shapes of the shadows and the shapes of the highlights and made sure that I preserved those highlights. Again, on the last blueberry, I'm just going through it one more time. I started to build up the layers, starting in the darkest shadows, and then bringing out some of my mid-tones, deepening the shadows as I went. Every time that I would add another layer, I would judge, did the shadows need to be darker or not. I used those same mixtures of the three blues and a little red. The red was for my darkest, and also I put a splash of red in there because the cranberries were reflecting into the blueberry. So once I got all of that done and made sure it was dry, I went and started on the stem end and started adding in all of the little details wet on dry to make sure that they didn't bleed, capturing those highlights and getting all of the shadows in there in the correct tone. Until I had more than three blueberries, but three full blueberries. Then we started on the cranberries, and the cranberries were just a nice orangey, peachy mix. I wet that just like I did the blueberries and added the color wet on wet. I did lifting out of the highlight with my damp, dry brush. Then I added a little more red to the mixture and started deepening the shadows while it was still wet, letting the water do the work. And the water blended nice and beautifully while I was still trying to preserve my highlights. I let that layer dry completely, and then I came back wet on dry, and I began to paint in the shadows, the darkest shadows, making sure that I took my damp brush and softened the edges of the highlights so that there wouldn't be a harsh edge. And then I added a little bit more orange to make the highlight more peachy colored, and I added that while it was still wet. And then I picked up some of the pigment with a damp dry brush. I added a darker red for the shadows, and then I started on the next cranberry with the same exact procedure. I put in the shadows wet on wet. I added a little bit more of the red for a richer, deeper shadow. And I started painting in the shadow shapes, trying to preserve the highlights by painting around them. The berry was completely dry, so I'm doing wet on dry, and then I'm just softening the edges of the highlights so that there's not a hard, sharp edge there. Just softening it up with a damp brush. And just continue trying to get all of the shapes of the shadows in there. And then the details at the stem end, I'm doing that with really crisp, wet on dry detail work. Once the berries were complete, I moved on to the leaves. All of three of the leaves, they've got a base coat of a really bright yellow-green. I let that yellow-green dry. once I got it all on there, this is just the base coat. This is the coat that's going to shine through the next layers, because I'm going to use a glazing technique on these leaves. So you get that base coat down. Once it's dry completely, I'm coming back in with a mid-tone green and a little bit of blue and a little bit of the yellow green. So I have 3 different tones of green there. And I start filling in the segments of the leaves, making sure that I paint around the veins, leaving those veins dry, because at the end I want those veins to be bright and to be visible. In my shadows, I added a little bit more of the blue with the green mixture, just to get those shadows in, being really careful to go against the vein but not paint over the veins. I'm also paying attention to where the shadows would be in the leaves, and that the lower half of the leaf would be a little bit darker than the upper half of the leaf. So in the upper half of the leaf, there's more bright green, more yellow green. I also decided to start doing a stippling technique with my different tones of green, so that some of that yellow base color shines through. Now it's dry completely, so it is shining through, and I'm just doing a wet on dry and doing a stippling type technique to get this texture in there. I'm still keeping up with the lighter yellow green to the tip of the leaves, and the deeper blue green is near the shadows, where the shadows are cast. Also going around those veins and leaving those veins completely unpainted, so that they would be more visible in the end product. So I went ahead, continued that, being mindful of where the lights and darks would be, and adjusting my paint accordingly. If it was darker, I would add more blue. If it was in a light area, I would add more of the yellow green. Mid-tones would be the mid-tone green. Once that was finished, I moved on to the raspberries. The raspberries got a nice clear water wash, and then a nice pink wash. That's going to be their base coat, and that is going to be the basis of their highlights. That's what color their highlights will be. Then I just took each of the raspberries section by section, and I painted around the highlights, and I did wet on dry. And then when I needed to soften around those highlights, I would just take a damp brush and just soften into the highlights, so that there wouldn't be a harsh edge, and it would give it that soft, smooth, round look. I added a little bit of blue to the red mixture where I wanted to have some shadows. I also was careful to paint and leave a small little margin between the sections to give off the hint of a highlight. And what I actually did was I just tried to pay attention to the shapes of the shadows in each of the segments. I took my time, just taking it segment by segment so that I wouldn't get overwhelmed, and just focused on that one segment that I was painting. And I worked my way around the raspberry using the same wet on dry method. The raspberry was dry, and would just come in with wet paint and smooth out wherever I wanted the highlight to be, so it wouldn't be a harsh, hard line on those highlights. And just continued to pay attention to where all of the shadow work was and where the highlights were. It looks a little daunting, but it's really not, as long as you pay attention to where shadows are and where the highlights are, and keep those kind of soft, so there's not a lot of hard edges around the highlight area. So I worked my way all around the raspberry. This is the first one of the 3, getting in all of the shadows. Wherever I wanted a darker shadow, I would add blue, and I would judge against all of the other colors to see if any of the sections needed to be darkened up, or if I needed to lift some of the color out. And sometimes it's easier to tell once you get the whole thing painted if you need to add anything. Now the center of the raspberry, I just added a little bit of orange and blue into that mixture and made the center. Then I moved on to the second raspberry, and I used the same exact technique. I did it section by section with the same red, using blue as the shadow, the blue mixed with the red as the shadow area, softening up the highlights as I go, so it's not really difficult if you take it section by section. It's not so overwhelming and daunting. So don't let it scare you trying to do raspberries. Just do them section by section and don't worry about the whole thing. Some people do the whole thing at one time. I find it easier for me to focus on section by section. And be sure to go back to your reference photo, look at it more than you are actually looking at your painting, so that you're really soaking in those details, those shadows where they're the darkest, the highlights where they're positioned, the shapes of the shadows. Those are the things that are important. And then I just kept working with the same exact method all around the whole raspberry until I was satisfied and got everything how I felt like the shadows were. Then I filled in the inside with a little bit of the blue and the red and a touch of the orange. The inside of the berry, I came back to the other one once that was dry and added a few more shapes in there to actually define the inside of the berry more. The last berry, I did the same exact way as I did these first two berries. Then we moved on to the shadow. I moved on to the shadow. My shadow is a purpley gray mixture. I am going to wet the paper, and my brush has a little bit of the shadow color on, which is fine. The things you need to remember about a shadow is they are darkest underneath the subject, and they fade lighter as it moves away from the subject. It gets lighter until it fades into light. So that's the main thing you need to worry about shadows. Shadows anchor your subject on the paper so that it doesn't look like it's floating out there in space. And once you finish that shadow, you will have a beautiful, beautiful fruit painting, fresh fruit painting. Now, the complete tutorial is in my online watercolor school, Viv Studio, and to find out about how to join, go to www.artwithviv.com, or if you just want a free course, I also have a free course, How to Paint a Beautiful Butterfly with Watercolor, and you go to the same place, www.artwithviv.com. I hope to see you over there. Bye.